Story 1. I believe that calculating your gross monthly income for rental applications is more revealing than taxes because it reflects all deductions. Story 2. I'm in the UK. We don't have to do taxes. The vast majority of paid employees are under pay as you earn, where the employer directly pays your taxes from your salary to the government before you see anything. When I was self-employed, I had to do my taxes, though. As someone with a degree in mathematics, let me say, what an obscure, incomplete, useless bunch of nonsense with no advice, clear definitions, or useful guidance whatsoever to fill out a bunch of forms intended for large companies, even if a sole trader, and hold you responsible if you make a mistake. In the end, I worked out that the time I was spending on it made it cheaper to just put a figure in the income box, zero everywhere else, and then send it off. Sure, I could have claimed for a travel card here or a lunch there, but it just wasn't worth the effort and the risk of getting it wrong. Nobody ever questioned or audited my tax forms, presumably because people scamming you don't just claim nothing back each time. I could have hired an accountant, kept years of receipts, and tried to justify them all, but it honestly wasn't worth the effort. Doing it yourself is nearly impossible unless your finances are that simple. I was a consultant, so I charged clients, all of whom were official government entities, received income, and my actual costs were near zero anyway. It's centuries of archaic tax law, case law, exemptions, and definitions that aren't simply written down anywhere, leading to complicated strategies to try to cheat the system. To be honest, it just wasn't worth the hassle of doing so. Nowadays, you wouldn't be able to do what I did because they would argue you were subject to intermediate taxation, a law requiring individuals like myself to prove that they are working for multiple clients and not just one client who could employ them normally via pay-as-you-earn. Navigating that is a nightmare. If I wasn't already a full-time pay-as-you-earn employee, I'd just use an umbrella company to handle all that nonsense and treat me as a pay-as-you-earn employee. It would mean losing roughly the same amount as paying an accountant, doing it yourself, etc., but without the risk of either. Pay-as-you-earn employees do not assume the risk of making mistakes with their taxes. That responsibility lies with the company that employs them. Now I work in the back end of information technology in a company that has almost exclusively pay-as-you-earn employees and or licensed contractors, with their payroll outsourced to a payroll provider for the same reasons. The complexity, archaic nature, and lack of any formal definitions or proper guidance, combined with the assumption of all risk associated with any mistakes, means I would never bother doing taxes for myself ever again, even if I were a millionaire who spent nothing and had simple income. It's just not worth it. I'd start a company, have them do it all, and just be a paid employee. Story 3. How much money do they take? Throughout my life, people have said that I won't receive Social Security, but I still contributed. Story 4. How many hidden deductions are there that no one really talked to me about? I was shocked by 2. First, laundry expenses. If you wear a uniform for work and wash it yourself, and it's not everyday clothing, it's completely deductible. Second, mileage deduction. If you keep a log using apps like MileKeeper or MileIQ, every business mile can save you approximately 65 cents multiplied by your tax rate. For example, 15% federal plus state. Story 5. I was amazed at how incredibly easy and straightforward it was, taking only a maximum of 30 minutes. I was surprised that so many people complain about their inability to complete it when there are millions of online videos and tutorials available for free. I was also astonished that everyone wishes school taught them about taxes, as anyone who can read at a third-grade level can figure it out on their own with minimal effort. Story 6. I was self-employed and attending college at the time. I made around $50,000 or $60,000, which was a significant amount more than usual back then, 25 years ago. I expected to have numerous deductions and credits for being in school and didn't realize I would end up owing a substantial amount. I was shocked to find myself owing $10,000. It was a real eye-opener. Story 7. H&R Block charges around $40 to pay their fee with your return. It should not be that difficult for you to manage that. Story 8. My first time was in 1986. I went to the library and obtained a paper form. I was 16, and the entire process took me 30 minutes to complete and mail in. A few months later, I received a check for approximately $11. Story 9. The number of things that were interpretive or subjective instead of objective. Heaven forbid you interpret something incorrectly. Story 10. My first job out of college, I noticed my withholdings from my weekly paycheck and realized I could afford a better apartment and a nicer car if I could just keep half of what was deducted. By April, I realized I wasn't receiving enough back to make up the difference. I was going from somewhat poor to actually poor. This experience made me somewhat of an economic conservative until I finally found a job that paid enough that I didn't mind the tax burden. Story 11. The entire tax filing process is frustrating. The Internal Revenue Service knows the answer. Just process everything and return what I am owed. Story 12. The thing that shocks me the most is how many people here act like they give a lot of money to the government and get nothing in return. Story 13. If you are in the right income bracket, meaning not so poor that you made no income but less than the average person, the government will actually give you money. Your refund can be more than what you paid in taxes. Story 14. I had to pay just £1 in tax for the year because I was £5 over the minimum tax threshold. It seems to happen every year. Story 15. The fact that I had to address this when the government already knows how much I owe them or they owe me. Story 16. My wife and I both work. The first time I did our taxes, I thought I got it wrong because the amount was significant. It turns out that if you are married and both working, you need to ensure you are withholding enough. I am not sure if it is because we moved into a higher tax bracket or something else, but that year was challenging. Story 17. The standard deduction always ends up being what I take, and trying to be clever with all my receipts doesn't matter. Story 18. At the time, I quietly thought socialism and mild communism might work in the United States. Doing my taxes for the first time felt like walking around blindfolded in a room full of rakes, just waiting for those handles to hit me in the face. Story 19. I had to do them at all. Seriously, no one ever told me about filing taxes. I think it was a year or two before I filed for the first time. I was a teenager, and I thought I was going to be in so much trouble. Story 20. When I discovered how much I owed the Internal Revenue Service, I realized I needed to adjust my withholdings. The following year, I had to take out more from my paycheck to compensate. Fortunately, the difference was only $5,000. I found myself in a situation where I was not wealthy enough to benefit from tax breaks and loopholes, yet not poor enough to receive assistance. Story 21. They already had the information, and I was essentially just double-checking the work as an amateur doing it for professionals. Story 22. In Canada, it wasn't my first time filing taxes, but it was my first time filing as a couple and with a dependent. It turns out that Canadian income tax does not offer much benefit for double-income couples. You essentially file your income tax as if you were single, receiving no additional deductions if there are no deductions to transfer. The only exception is that you can combine donation deductions, resulting in a larger deduction than if you filed separately. Having a dependent does not provide any additional deductions either. Story 23. The fact that even though I was living and working in another country, they still expected me to file. Story 24. When I was a tutor, I had to pay an additional self-employment tax, even though I earned very little. Story 25. For everyone saying how easy it was compared to how many people complain about doing them, it used to be much more complicated before computer programs calculated everything and simplified the process. Story 26. The entire process is frustrating. They send you paperwork with all the information, and then you have to go to a website and enter the information. If you enter it incorrectly, you could face consequences. They send you all this paperwork because they know your income and whether you owe money or are due a refund. However, if you do not enter certain numbers, it feels like you haven't filed your taxes and could potentially face serious penalties. In better developed countries, they simply inform their citizens about their tax obligations or expected refunds. Why can't we do the same? The Internal Revenue Service knows if you filed your taxes incorrectly, but they refuse to automate the filing process. Every time I file my taxes, I notice they ask for comments. When I use my bank services, I often think this process is completely pointless. The Internal Revenue Service already possesses this information. It feels absurd that I must provide answers to questions we both already know, and it seems like the system is maintained by unreasonably complex methods rather than common sense. This reliance on outdated procedures has dumbed down our ability to question and improve the system. Story 27. Not the first time, but the first time as a married couple. Everyone acts like it is some magical tax break that saves you a lot of money. It did not change anything. Story 28. When I started my career, I was doing gig work. Some companies hired me as an employee for a week, while others hired me as a contractor. By the end of the year, I had 11 W-2s and 15 1099s. I went to an accountant who was a friend of my brother-in-law. I dropped off my taxes to him on March 10th. He called me on April 9th, 3 business days before taxes were due, to say that he couldn't figure out my taxes and couldn't complete them. I got my information back, and in a panic, I tried doing it on TurboTax. But when I saw I owed $5,000, I panicked even more. I called my dad, who seems to know someone for everything. He was at his friend's bar, and his friend recommended his accountant. I called that accountant and set up a meeting with him. He took my paperwork and calculated everything while I shared my journey so far. When he finished, he looked at me and said, "So, you currently owe $7,000. But I want to ask you some questions." He then started to inquire about my living situation, my car, mileage and gas expenses, my clothes, tools, and any work equipment or professional services I had purchased. He managed to reduce my tax liability to $800. I have been going to him ever since. Basically, it can be very easy if you have one job, but the more jobs you have, the more states you work in, and the more you write off, the more complicated it becomes. Story 29. The amount I was losing in each paycheck to taxes that I was getting back at the start of the new year was significant. I immediately took my withholding form and looked up a few guides on how to fill it out properly. Now, I owe at most $100 a year, but my paychecks are $200 to $300 larger. Story 30. If you are single and have no dependents, it's easy. As soon as you start applying for deductions or include a 1099 form, you begin to understand why the tax code is so complicated. Like law, it needs to be treated as another industry. Story 31. Not so much shocked as frustrated by the random items I should have brought with me and the specific documents required. I show up to do my taxes, and then I am told I should have saved all this information. For instance, I used my dependent care account for childcare. I had to submit receipts to receive those funds, so I figured it was handled. However, I need to show proof of childcare expenses. So I bring copies of those same receipts that I submitted, right? Wrong. Those are no longer valid. I need a specific end-of-year form from my childcare provider that includes the same information but as a cumulative total. Additionally, I should have saved receipts from when I bought a new window. It's too late for that. Those are long gone. Story 32. I could do it over the phone. It was 1988 or 1989, and you could type your information on the keypad. It was only for 1040 easy filing, which I was using at the time. So much technology for that era. Story 33. When I started my first job, I had no idea what withholding was, so I exempted myself. I was making $33,000 at the time and owed $4,400 in taxes. Story 34. I am classified as a self-employed person, and I have been told that my taxes are complicated because of that. I am unsure if this is true, so I hire someone to handle them for me. However, I am always shocked by how much I have to pay and what percentage of my income it represents, especially when I recall how little people who earn significantly more than I do have to pay. Story 35. My situation can be a bit complicated, but since all information regarding taxes is easily accessible, I ask questions to ChatGPT, and it provides clear and helpful advice. Story 36. I get my money back? I always feel convinced that, for some reason, I will end up owing about $12 million. Story 37. For most regularly employed people, the Canada Revenue Agency already knows the majority of your tax return, but still requires you to submit it yourself, and you're in trouble if you make a mistake. If you miss a slip, transpose a number, or make any errors, everything gets double-checked against what is already on file. If you know what your return is supposed to be, why hide it from me like some kind of sick game? That was when I first started doing taxes. Now, they've made it so you can import the tax slips on file with the Canada Revenue Agency into a tax program, and all you have to do is fill in any additional information you have. It's such a handy feature and makes so much more sense. It takes about 10 minutes for me to file my own taxes. The downside is that you have to wait until closer to the filing deadline because sometimes the slips aren't all loaded. This year, they're quite behind. But I'd rather wait the extra month than gather my slips and sift through them myself. Story 38. The first time I did my own taxes this year, I expected to feel more anxiety about doing something wrong. But once I hit the finish button and closed my laptop, I felt pretty confident that I didn't miss anything. Story 39. One of the most surprising things to me the first time I filed my taxes was discovering that you can actually receive money back. I had no idea that tax refunds existed. I didn't know that you could overpay throughout the year and then get a portion of that money refunded. Story 40. Tax credits provide an interesting aspect of the tax system. I understood the concept of withholding and realized my tax refund would be less than the total amount I contributed over the year. However, I was surprised to discover that tax credits can actually result in a refund exceeding the amount of money contributed. While this may apply primarily to individuals facing financial hardship with dependents, it is remarkable that the Internal Revenue Service can provide more money to individuals than it collects. Story 41. I made $15,000 a year and had to pay $1,500 in taxes. Then, when I made $115,000 a year, I only had to pay $300 in taxes. What a difference. Story 42. I had to do a lot of math. I completed it on paper, added everything by hand, checked and double-checked, and still found errors. Of course, this was 50 years ago. Story 43. I live in Sweden, and taxes are sent directly to my digital government inbox. I can check through it, which takes about 10 seconds, and then I digitally sign and submit it if I don't want to make any changes. The first time I filed taxes, I was surprised by how much money I was earning under the table, which the tax authorities didn't seem to care about. This was because my first real income came from being a football referee, which is considered hobby work here, making it essentially tax-free for up to €3,000 per year. However, I was doing nearly daily matches and earning an average of €200 per game for 6 months straight, but I had to pay an additional tax of €0.2 that year. It seems that football clubs were not good at reporting how much they paid referees, so they didn't have any records on me. Since I didn't keep track either, I simply accepted what they sent me. They also didn't want my €0.2 in tax. They carried it over to the next year, where I ended up getting money back from taxes. Story 44. Not income tax, but property tax. Nobody told me about it. Not my parents, not my school teachers, not my tax preparer, not my real estate agent, not my loan agent, nobody. It wasn't until I bought my house and received a bill for thousands of dollars that someone thought to explain it to me. Story 45. When my son bought his first condominium, he had 3 or 4 months of interest he was able to write off for the tax year. Surprisingly, the following tax year, when he had a full year of interest, he received almost the same amount of refund. He is single with no dependents. This doesn't sound right to me. Story 46. We have to complete the task even if the government double-checks it. I made a mistake and was made aware of the interest charges. Why do I need to do it myself or pay someone else to do it when the government does it anyway? Story 47. I was getting a significant return each year, resembling an extra paycheck. I have learned to adjust my withdrawal amount to avoid giving the federal government an interest-free loan with my own money. Story 48. My parents illegally claimed me on their taxes and kept all the tax credits they received, taking nearly $1,000 right out of my pocket. When I confronted them, they refused to apologize or offer to repay me, saying they needed it to cover renovations on their new house. Parents who owned 5 properties took advantage of their son, whom they kicked out the moment he graduated high school, for nearly $1,000 and felt they did nothing wrong. I should have reported them. Story 49. I wasn't getting back as much as my coworker. He bought a used car and went on vacation. It turns out he was committing tax fraud. Story 50. How easy it was. A quick review of the figures verified their correctness, and I signed at the bottom of the form and mailed it in. It's been so long now that I am unsure if I actually mailed it or if my first submission was late enough that we didn't have to send it if there were no corrections to make. Story 51. The only thing that surprises me about doing taxes is that we have to do them ourselves when the Internal Revenue Service has all the information and a computer system could easily automate the process. It just seems like a very unstreamlined and complicated process. Story 52. The government knows exactly what I owe but won't tell me. It feels like a game show where the prize is avoiding an audit. Story 53. Before I completed my taxes myself, I took my T4 to a well-known place. I only had a single slip, which took a few minutes. My return was $14, and they charged me $75. I later learned how easy it was to enter a few numbers in the forms. Story 54. For the very first time, I realized how much of my salary goes to taxes. It's surprising that I was in a low tax bracket for a long time. I also paid someone to handle my taxes the first time after I moved out on my own. Story 55. I struggle to understand how a system that deducts taxes from paychecks expects us to guess how much we should pay. They have the data. Can't they just tell us how much we owe? Story 56. Wait, I tell the government all these things about my money, and they make sure I am accurate? Then why don't they just do it? Maybe send me a draft for edits? Story 57. I still don't understand why our tax code is so complicated. A flat tax would save time and money. Story 58. When I received my first restricted stock unit on the vesting date, I was shocked to see that some were sold for tax withholding. I was a new graduate at the time, and for some naive reason, I thought that restricted stock units were not taxable until I sold them. Story 59. It's easy to find many criticisms about public schools, such as, "Hey teacher, can you teach me how to file taxes?" No, but insert an irrelevant thing you learned in school here. It's frustrating. Hopefully, teachers aren't wasting my child's time teaching them to copy and paste numbers into boxes. Story 60. How easy it is to do taxes on your own with TurboTax. Until 2 years ago, many people lost money. My husband and I now use a professional because we don't want to owe $2,000 to the government again. Story 61. I thought the system would catch it if I made a mistake or that if I later caught it, I would be given a chance to rectify it. Story 62. What surprises me is how much nonsense there is to sift through, and doing it by myself makes it unlikely that I will catch everything. I need to hire someone to handle it, as it may seem like an easy task to them. Story 63. How much money did we get back? We had transitioned from graduate students to salaried careers, and I was shocked at how living on $20,000 a year made it such a scramble to pay any amount in taxes. Then, making $60,000 as a family, we received a substantial return. Of course, our withholdings were too high, which we adjusted, but it was still surprising to have paid our fair share in taxes, receive some money back, and still afford a middle-class lifestyle. Of course, this was about 15 years ago, but I still feel thankful for our middle-class lives. I'm worried that will change drastically in the near future. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.